That's the kind of day that you get to solo. There are a few aerodynamic reasons why icing is so dangerous, and there's been a lot of people die that way. Hey everyone, welcome back to Aerosafe. I'm Erica. I'm a flight instructor and instrument instructor in Kentucky. Here on Aerosafe, we do a weather analysis for general aviation pilots. We're looking at areas of VFR weather, areas of IFR weather, and some potential hazards that could exist in both of those areas. As general aviation pilots, we're flying piston aircraft, not approved for flight into known icing, generally speaking. We don't have the ability to get above the weather. Weather is a causal or contributing factor in far too many general aviation accidents. The goals here are a few. Number one is to help educate you on how to do your own pre-flight weather briefing. Another is to show you what kind of resources and products are available. And then the third is to help you make a more informed go or no-go decision. We'll start, as we always do, with the surface analysis. Right now, it's Monday morning, January 29th at 10:12 Eastern, or 15:12 Zulu. Over this past weekend, the eastern coast of the U.S. was largely faced with low ceilings and precipitation. That was caused by a low pressure system and occluded front. Now that has moved out from the east coast, but there are some remnants, troughs, those yellow dashed lines that exist over Pennsylvania stretching eastward. And then there's also a trough over Virginia stretching down into North Carolina. Now that trough is an area of rising air, but because it's elongated, there's not really much place for it to go rather than straight up. So that does create some of what we're seeing today, which is low ceilings and a little bit of precipitation. I saw some flurries this morning. Now on the backside of that, we've got a nice big high pressure system, and that's going to be creating a lot of VFR weather. Behind that, there's low pressure with a trough, and then, some alternating pressure systems as we move farther west. Over the four corners, there are some high pressure systems, and again, some more troughs and low pressure. We don't really see a lot of fronts over the U.S. right now, but there is a cold front moving in from the northwest. As we see, that's already creating some precipitation, some rain, and as that moves farther in, that precipitation will likely be freezing. We'll move on now to the interactive map and take a look at the conditions that affect us as general aviation pilots. Large areas of marginal, VFR, IFR, and low IFR, the midwestern part of the U.S. almost, likely created by those troughs that we looked at earlier. Low IFR, of course, means that there are very low ceilings or very low visibility. The IFR, which is going to be the red dots, indicate that there's a ceiling below 1,000 and visibility at or below 3 miles. The marginal means we're in between that categorical IFR and the VFR. So that area is of course going to be IFR. However, in a minute, we're going to look at the freezing levels. If it's IFR and within an AirMet Zulu or below the freezing level, or if the freezing level is low, that would be a no-go situation. It's looking absolutely beautiful through a large part of the country. Lots of open stations. So there's a circle that's green and the inside is white. That means there's absolutely no ceilings at all. North Platte, Nebraska. Wind is 310 at 4 knots. 10 miles of visibility and clear. That's beautiful. That's the kind of day that you get to solo. That's really, really nice. And that exists through a lot of the U.S. too. We'll look at Kansas City. Very similar, pretty nominal winds. 210 at 7, 10 miles of visibility and clear. Another absolutely beautiful day. Now, up here in Idaho and Montana and little speckled spots here and there, what's really interesting is that we have one station that will report clear, no ceiling VFR, and then very close to it, low IFR. What's going on is freezing fog, FZFG. Quarter mile of visibility. So there is no wind. Temperature and dew point spread is non-existent. Temperature is -1, dew point's -1. When the temperature dew point spread is low or there is no spread, meaning they are the same, that means that the air has reached its saturation point. The excess moisture has nowhere to go other than to condense. We combine that temperature dew point spread with temperatures at or below freezing, and the condensation will form as ice or freezing fog. Now, it is pretty early in Idaho. I would assume that as the day goes on, it's going to warm up. So we can use our little timeline here at the bottom. We can move that forward a few hours and see what's going on. Let's say that we move it 3 hours into the future. A lot of that freezing fog has dissipated as the air warms up. So this is saying that at 1800 Zulu, there will be a low layer scattered at 302 miles of visibility with BR is mist, but I remember that as baby rain. It will eventually clear up. We're going to get few at 20,000 over there in McCall, Idaho. So as the day goes on, temperatures warm up. The air is no longer saturated because that temperature dew point spread is going to increase. And it's going to clear up, get rid of that low level of clouds and fog on the surface. Going from that 1800 Zulu to 1500 Zulu. Many stations in that area are low IFR now, but will improve in conditions as the day goes on. The only real place that we see precipitation is up there over the coast of Washington. Generally speaking, at areas of IFR and areas of VFR, that area from northern Alabama, Mississippi, stretching all the way up to Maine, that's going to be IFR. And we're going to look in just a second at some additional hazards that exist there. Also, Idaho, Wyoming right now, there are some areas of low IFR, but that's a result of low fog, that early morning low temperatures. As the day goes on and the temperatures increase, we will see a lot of that dissipate. Aside from, right now, this very second, that fog that exists, pretty much most things west of the Mississippi are going to be VFR today. Really, really nice. Now, let's look at our air mets and see some potential hazards that exist in those areas. When I'm looking at air mets, I like to start with the Zulu and the freezing level, because for me, if there's an air met Zulu, there's not even any point in looking any farther. Now, part of what we're doing here is an exercise of using these products and looking through all of the conditions and making a decision based on those conditions. So we'll continue looking at those areas, right? In my 172, I don't have the ability to take off icing from the wings or the prop or the windscreen. I do also fly a TBM, and the TBM is certified for flight into known icing. We have pneumatic boots that help break the ice off of the leading edges of the control surfaces. There's also prop de-ice and windscreen de-ice, and there's also equipment to keep ice from accumulating within the engine. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about those of us flying Diamonds, Pipers, Cessnas, small Cessnas. I say this every video, but icing conditions are an absolute no-go. Icing conditions are when we have temperatures at freezing level or below and visible moisture. So that could be rain, it could be some snow, it could be clouds. Any type of visible moisture linked with your outside air temperature being even around freezing. It could be 1 or 2 degrees Celsius where you're at, and you could still see a small accumulation of ice on your surfaces. There are a few aerodynamic reasons why icing is so dangerous. One of them is the accumulation of ice means additional weight. With that increased weight, we've got to produce additional lift to continue holding altitude or airspeed. In icing, we're not able to produce as much lift. That ice comes over the wings and disrupts the flow of air. It changes the shape of the wings, and the amount of lift that we're able to produce is diminished. So we're heavy, we're not able to produce enough lift to maintain that. A very, very dangerous thing that could happen is a tail stall as a result of icing. So our horizontal stabilizer produces lift downwards. That keeps our nose up. So if we get enough ice over our horizontal stabilizer so that it's not producing lift, our nose will go down, and if we don't have any control authority to change that naturally, we could see how that would result in some really bad situation. For those reasons, you're heavier, you're not producing enough lift, you could get a tail stall. In addition, the engine ingesting ice or accumulating ice on the air intake would prevent combustion from being able to continue to happen, which means no more boom in the engine, means no more spinny thing going forward. Icing is totally an absolute no-go. That being said, let's look at the current air met Zulus. That area of IFR that we saw stretching from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, all the way up to the northeast, up into Michigan as well, that had IFR conditions, also has an air met Zulu. No surprise there. Base of the icing air met begins at the freezing level, which is somewhere between the surface and 3,000 feet, and extends up to the top of 7,000 feet. Now, there's a couple reasons why the top of this air met could be 7,000 feet. One could be that that's the top of the clouds. Another could be that it's cold enough above that you won't get accumulation of ice. That whole area is going to be a no-go for me unless you can reasonably stay underneath the clouds, and because we've got marginal IFR, which means the ceiling below 3,000 feet, IFR or low IFR throughout that whole area, there's no way you could reasonably stay below that. Add to that, if we for a minute take off this Aeromet Zulu and add in the Aeromet Sierra, mountain obscuration. Number one, I'm not willing to scud run. There's a few dangers there. One is if you're flying just below the clouds to avoid icing conditions. If you inadvertently go into the clouds, then you're in icing conditions with nowhere to go. Two is that if you're staying just below the clouds and you're in mountainous terrain, you might not have appropriate separation between yourself and obstacles. In which case, that's where we often see controlled flight into terrain. And there's been a lot of people die that way. No reason. Could have just stayed on the ground and waited. So when we combine those low ceilings with the Aeromet Zulu and the Aeromet Sierra, which is the purple one here is mountain obscuration, the red one is IFR conditions, that's a total no-go situation. Just, wait. We also have an Aeromet Zulu up here along the northern part of the central U.S., and the base of that is 8,000, tops are at 19,000. So very reasonable there. Well, let's look at the freezing level as well. Whenever on the graphical Aeromets we see a filled in area, whole area has multiple freezing levels. Now this one is absolutely ginormous. It goes from Montana to Georgia. So those multiple freezing levels are between the surface and 11,000 feet. What would have been really nice, broke that up into smaller sections and said, oh, in this area, the freezing levels between the surface and 3,000. And this one is the 3,000 and 6,000. That'd be nice so that we could get a little bit more into the minutia, but they don't do that. This icing Aeromet, base at 8,000, tops at 19,000. There's a lot of variability in there. Let's look at one of these stations that's reporting low IFR and see what the temperature is on the surface. Cook, Minnesota. It's -1 on the surface. This is where we have to take all of the pieces into account, right? So this big graphical Aeromet is saying, oh, the freezing levels between the surface and 11,000. And then this Aeromet Zulu is saying you'll get moderate icing between 8,000 and 19,000. What about over here in the northeastern part of Minnesota? It's below freezing on the surface, which means the temperature is only going to get lower as you increase in altitude. And if you're in visible moisture and the temperature is freezing or below, ice, right? A little bit skeptical of that Aeromet there. And the truth of the matter is that I can't go into enough depth in any one particular area here to really make a go or no-go decision. We're just looking big picture, right? The point is that I'm showing you things that you can look at and think, oh, that might give me pause. Or let me look into that a little bit more deeply. And this is one of those. It would be really easy to just look at that icing Aeromet and say, oh, I'm not going to get icing until 8,000 feet. When in reality, the environmental conditions say otherwise up in that northeastern part of Minnesota. So I would avoid flying in the clouds really through any of that area. Now, we don't have an Aeromet Zulu over here, over all that stuff in Idaho. Very likely you could pick up ice there if you, for some reason, decided to take off at McCall, Idaho, with freezing fog and a quarter-mile visibility. Pretty much all of the other IFR areas do include some icing conditions. Columbus Air Force Base is not included in that Aeromet. They're overcast at 1,400 feet. Temperature is 4, dew point is 2. Graphical depiction of the freezing level shows the freezing level at 4,000. Even though there's not an Aeromet Zulu over that, indications lead to us believing that by the time you get up to cruise, you would accumulate some ice coming through that cloud layer, going through the freezing level at 4,000. One could reasonably expect you'd pick up ice. And if you look at the conditions and there's a reasonable expectation of ice, don't go. There's no reason to go. Whenever you see these red graphical Aeromets, they are depicting IFR conditions. So if you're a VFR pilot only, that would inherently say, okay, that's a no-go situation. Of course, if you are an instrument-rated pilot, that's when you want to take in a little bit more information. Look at those Aeromet Zulus, the freezing levels, winds, and also the cause of the IFR. It is worth talking about, though, that it is pretty high pressure where a lot of these low ceilings and IFR conditions exist. Typically with high pressure systems, it is very stable air. We don't see a lot of lifting action. We don't see a lot of buildups or convective activity. The cloud layers are typically very stable, and if you were in an aircraft where you could get above it, you would see that it's almost like a false horizon along the top. In your instrument training, you will learn that even if you're above the clouds, you can't use the clouds as a reference to the horizon, because who knows where the tops of those clouds are. It could, be a 15-degree incline one way or another. But the point is, when you see these air met Sierras, those IFR conditions, it's very important to look more in depth at why those conditions exist, what the trend will be for those conditions throughout your flight, any other hazards that might exist, like icing or turbulence. Let's look now at air met tangos. Tango for T, or turbulence. They're also going to be high surface winds and low level wind shear. So the green air mets that we see here are air met high for turbulence, typically beginning at 18,000 or above. It is important to look at those because they do give an indication of the stability of the atmosphere. Yellow air mets do indicate low-level turbulence, and they may show the severity as well. So moderate turbulence from the base to 9,000. The orange air mets indicate low-level wind shear, which means that there is a layer of wind that changes either direction or velocity in a small span. I choose not to fly in low-level wind shear, depending on the severity. The National Weather Service regional offices put out information about the TAFs. They look at the meteorological information and the data, and they make conclusions or forecasts about just how much wind shear there may be and at what altitude. So here in Kentucky, where I am, the Louisville National Weather Service office publishes the TAFs. Typically what we'll see is wind shear at 2,000 from whatever the direction is, say 260 at however many knots. So most recently I've seen wind shear at 50 knots, which is very dangerous for us in the speeds at which we fly. And a loss of 50 knots is going to put you well below the stall speed. Now, it's not often an instant loss, it's gradual. And as you come through that wind shear layer, there is often some turbulence, and the greater the difference in wind, the greater the turbulence as those air molecules rub against each other. But generally speaking, in the training environment and for my own comfort, if I'm doing, just a pleasure flight, I choose not to fly in low-level wind shear. There are times that I will take a student in low-level wind shear so that they can see it and experience it, but it's within some certain limitations. Certainly not 50 knots of wind shear. Let's take a brief second to look at winds aloft. It looks like throughout most of the country it's pretty light. On the eastern U.S., it looks like at 5,000, 15 to 25 knots. Winds aloft, that's pretty good. If you're flying here, if you're flying to the south, that's going to really help you out. If you're flying to the north, make sure you're taking that wind aloft into account for your time, for your legs, and your fuel burn. Like the Midwest area, I see 10 knots, 15. As we move farther north, North Dakota and Minnesota, I see 25 to 35 knots, and that's a pretty westerly wind. So if you're flying to the east, you'll get a nice little tailwind. If you're flying west, again, be sure that you're taking that wind aloft into account for your time en route and your fuel burn. Winds at 10,000 are pretty light across the west. 5 knots, I see 15, 20, and it is moving clockwise here, which would indicate high pressure system. And if we look back at the surface analysis, boop, there she is. I just turned on the SIGMETS layer. We have no SIGMETS across the country. Way out in the Atlantic Ocean, there's a thunderstorm. Now we're going to look briefly at the surface prog chart, 24 hours out, and the low-level significant weather chart for 24 hours out. That high pressure that was kind of in the lower Midwest area has moved up and east, so that's going to bring a lot of that pretty weather in. We do have a low pressure system and a occluded front coming in over from the Great Lakes, and that's bringing with it some cold front. It's going to make it chilly. We've got a low pressure over Colorado and a trough, and some high pressure along the backside of that. Low pressure forming up over the coast of Washington with a warm front and a cold front that's catching up to it. That's going to make, of course, an occluded front. So it's probably going to be pretty yucky up here the next day or two. Great Lakes area is getting some precipitation, and being that there's a cold front involved there, an included front, it's going to probably, large parts of it are going to be frozen precipitation, a little bit of rain. So if we compare that to the low-level significant weather chart, we can see atmospheric conditions are going to change our actual observed conditions. Moderate turbulence or greater at 12,000 feet. Where that low pressure system is, it's going to be stormy. There's going to be some convective activity, I'm sure, with that low pressure and included front. You're getting moderate or greater turbulence as well. Blue cloud-looking areas are marginal VFR. Within that, often what we do see is these IFR areas as well. The red lines indicate where ceiling's going to be below 1,000 feet and or visibility below 3 miles. Northeast, we're going to be staying kind of yucky for at least a day. Purple squigglies indicate freezing at the surface, which means that there's going to be icing conditions there if there's visible moisture. Tomorrow, the Northeast is going to stay marginal VFR or IFR to include freezing conditions. The Northwest is going to get a little bit yuckier there than it is right now, so larger areas of marginal VFR and IFR. The Southeast and along the South is going to be pretty nice. I was hopeful that tomorrow would be better. If you are interested in some personalized flight instruction or ground instruction, please feel free to reach out to me at gilbertaviation.com. If you liked what you saw, be sure to give a like and subscribe. Keep it coming. I've got some really interesting stuff coming up in the future. Interviews with National Weather Service and Leidos. If you have any questions about anything I talked today, please also drop a comment below and ask. I'd be happy to respond and chat about it. Tomorrow night, I'll be a guest on the Midlife Pilot podcast, which goes live at 8 Eastern or 7 Central on their YouTube channel. I'll link it below. They also post podcast episode after the fact. I'll be talking about weather and decision making and also things that you can do to stay proficient while you're on the ground. I'm super excited to have a chat with those guys. If you're interested in getting some Aerosafe swag, answer this question in the comments below. When you look at all of the aviation weather products available, are there any hazards that exist that keep you from flying today? Do you live under one of those AirMet Zulus up in the Northeast? Maybe you live in one of those areas of low-level wind shear. Drop a comment below, answer that question, and I'll reach out to get your swag. Thanks so much for watching Aerosafe today. We'll see you next time.